Hello. Welcome to the Billy Wilder Theater at the Hammer Museum. I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the Director of Public Programs, and it's my great honor tonight to introduce Angela Davis and Robin Levi. So now to the issue of the day. The United States prison system has been controversial since the aftermath of the Civil War, when innocent black men were systematically imprisoned and forced to work as a way of perpetuating slavery. Today, 1.6 million Americans are in prison, and another 750,000 are in local jails. Since our total population is around 230 million people, this means that almost 1 in 100 people, American adults, are behind bars. That's the other 1%. Significantly, this huge chunk of the population is also stripped of their voting rights and therefore without the option of participating in government. The United States has the highest incarceration rates in the world, and the rates are very skewed by race, educational background, and economic status. Today, 1 in 15 adult black male Americans are behind bars. In recent years, we've had talks here at the Hammer by Michelle Alexander, the author of the new Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness, and by Mark Maurer, who's the executive director of the Sentencing Project and the author of Race to Incarcerate. Both of them here were breaking down the statistics of who's in prison today and how it got that way. But both of them said that major contributing factors include the so-called war on drugs, the 3 strikes laws, and the highly profitable and powerful lobby of the prison industrial complex. One of today's speakers has spent a lifetime analyzing and criticizing the prison system, both at the applied level in terms of looking at incarceration today in America and abroad, as well as at a higher level as a philosophical issue of justice, oppression, and democracy. Our other speaker today has spent her life advocating on behalf of women's rights, especially the abuse of women in U.S. prisons. These issues are some of the most important topics of our times. Enormous amount of tax dollars are going into building ever more private prisons. Somewhere around $100 billion a year are spent on corrections. Please silence your cell phones. According to the New York Times, the recent immigration laws passed in Arizona were actually written and paid for by a private prison corporation looking to drum up more business by jailing illegal immigrants. Here in California, we've opened 1 new prison each year for 23 years, and still they're all filled double their capacity. Overcrowding of prisoners and lack of basic medical care has become so severe that it led to a hunger strike by over 10,000 California prisoners this summer. The extreme corruption that's going towards so-called corrections needs to be examined and stopped, but many of us never even hear about it because the other 1%, the incarcerated 1%, are kept silent without the right to vote. To this end, we bring you tonight 2 of the best minds working on these issues, Robin Levi and Angela Davis. Robin Levi is the Human Rights Director at Justice Now, which uses the International Human Rights Framework to expose and remedy human rights violations inside women's prisons, especially violations of the right to health and the right to family. Robin is also the co-editor of the recently released Inside the Place, Not of It, Narratives from Women's Prisons, which is a collection of first-person testimonies by women in prison. A 1993 graduate of Stanford Law School, Robin has written and spoken extensively on women's rights here and abroad. Prior to joining Justice Now, she was at the Women's Institute for Leadership for Human Rights, which advocated for the rights of women and girls in the United States, especially women of color. She was also a consultant to the Drug Policy Alliance, where she worked to end the war on drugs, and she was the staff attorney at the Women's Rights Division of Human Rights Watch, where she monitored and documented violence and discrimination against women worldwide, including in Russia and sexual abuse of women in the U.S. state prisons. Angela Davis is a founding member of Critical Resistance, a national organization dedicated to no less than the dismantling of the prison industrial complex. Internationally, she's affiliated with Sisters Inside, an abolitionist organization that works in solidarity with women in prison. Through her activism and scholarship over the last decades, Angela Davis has been deeply involved in our nation's quest for social justice. Her work as an educator, both at the university level and in the larger public sphere, have always emphasized the importance of building communities of struggle for economic, racial, and gender justice. Professor Davis is the author of 8 books and has lectured extensively worldwide. In recent years, a persistent theme of her work has been the range of social problems associated with incarceration and the generalized criminalization of those communities that are most affected by poverty and racial discrimination. She draws upon her own experiences in the early 70s as a person who spent 18 months in jail and on trial after being placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. She's also conducted extensive research in numerous issues related to race, gender, and imprisonment. Her most recent books are Abolition Democracy and Are Prisons Obsolete?, which is about the abolition of the prison industrial complex. Professor Davis's teaching career has taken her to San Francisco State, Mills College, and UC Berkeley. She's also taught here at UCLA, Vassar, the Claremont Colleges, and Stanford. She spent the last 15 years at UC Santa Cruz, where she is now Distinguished Professor Emerita of History of Consciousness and of Feminist Studies. Like many other educators, Professor Davis is especially concerned with the general tendency to devote more resources and attention to the prison system than to the education system. Her work now focuses on imagining a world without prisons and forging a 21st century abolitionist movement. So please join me in welcoming Robin Levi and Angela Davis.
Good evening, everyone. It's really wonderful to be here. It's good to see so many people here at the Hammer Museum. I guess I can say it's good to be back at UCLA again after many, many decades. And I would like to also suggest that you see the exhibit. It's really amazing. Now dig this. Okay, and I'm really happy to be here with Robin. We've known each other for a long time. We worked together, but this is the first time we've ever appeared publicly together. So it's good to be here with you, Robin.
Well, as you can imagine, it is fabulous and more than a little bit overwhelming to be here with you. I am honored and thrilled and a little freaked out. Beyond all the other fabulous things that Angela Davis has done, the organization I work for, Justice Now, is actually grew out of critical resistance and becoming an abolitionist prison organization. So, that was where we came from. And, Claudia got us started with a lot of really good stats and information about the prison system in general. And Angela and I wanted to kind of jump in and sort of focusing on women's prisons. And so to get us started, Angela, in your book, Are Prisons Obsolete?, you talk about prisons as being a gendering apparatus. Can you talk a little bit more about that and also about why it's important for us to be discussing women's prisons right now?
Well, first of all, I should probably say that that I've been doing this work for the vast majority of my life. And I did not really become conscious of the importance of focusing specifically on women's prisons until I went to jail myself. I was here in LA doing work to free political prisoners, doing work against prisons, but we imagine prisons as largely inhabited by men, as a male phenomenon. And it's true that the overwhelming majority of people behind bars are men. But if we look at the entire prison system, at the prison industrial complex, through the lens of women's prisons, we are able to understand so much more of what these institutions accomplish and the damage they create in all of our lives, regardless of whether we're in prison or not. And so I guess I would say that yes, prisons are they constitute this vast gendering apparatus, and the binary gender system that they promote is reflected in the fact that there are only women's prisons and men's prisons. And so what happens if you don't completely identify as a woman or a man? Well, this means also that looking at the prison system through the lens of trans prisoners teaches us so much more about the institution, that it's not it's not only or not primarily to address issues of crime. We always think of crime and punishment as this dyad that we can't pull apart, but that the prison system accomplishes so much more. And among other things, it supports this really intransigent system of gender that's based on the binary notion of male and female.
Yeah, and that's definitely, we've seen a lot of that in our work, and actually one of the narratives in the book is a man who's imprisoned in the women's prison and talking about the tensions that he feels. And one of the terms that we use to discuss it, particularly in the California prisons, is the forced feminization. And so there's a lot of energy put into, putting women into the box that they think they should be in. And, if you transgress the gender roles, then you're more likely to get into prison. So if you look in the population in women's prisons, there's a higher percentage of people who are lesbian or bi and who identify on the gender spectrum. And you see a much higher percentage of people in those categories, and they themselves experience a lot more abuse when they're inside. And one of the things, we were just talking about this earlier, that amazes me, and we can get into the different elements of the forced feminization, but the prohibition of boxer shorts in California prisons just astounds me. California women's prisons. So in California women's prisons, you're not allowed to wear boxer shorts. And I mean, the extent to which they've put the effort they've put into enforcing this. So they used to, one of the jobs in the women's prisons was to sew boxer shorts. Like one of their jobs was to make boxer shorts. So obviously these boxer shorts were getting onto the black market. So they prohibited, now they no longer make boxer shorts in there. And then they put the prison on lockdown for 3 days to search for the contraband boxer shorts. And that's an enormous amount of money.
Your taxpayer money is funding these searches,
to police underwear, right? And that's just one element of it. And so when you start examining these pieces that we've put into the prison system, it makes you sort of question, to what end are these rules put out? To what end, is it? And so, Morningstar, who's one of our narrators, talks about he's forced to wear these really loose scoop neck shirts that makes him feel uncomfortable, and is just another form of punishment. So the energy that's put into that is shocking.
And one of the things we've learned from looking at women in prison and women's prisons is the fact that sexual violence, domestic violence, can be situated on a continuum that moves from private spheres to public spheres. Women in prison have suffered, like so many women who are not in prison, from forms of violence that we normally think of as being private. Domestic violence, intimate violence. But many of the women who have experienced violence within the institution have pointed out that the violence they experience at the hands of the guards, at the hands of the institutions, feels no different from the violence they may have suffered at the hands of their partners. And I mention this because organizations like Insight, Women of Color Against Violence, and many other organizations have attempted to develop an analysis that allows us to see the continuum of violence that moves from private or intimate to public or institutional. And while this is very easy to see in relationship to women who describe the experience as being no different, it allows us to understand the extent to which the violence of institutions such as the prison, such as the military, is very much connected to the violence that we think of as individual. It allows us to ask the question, why is there so much violence against women in the world? Why does this pandemic still exist? Even after criminalizing violence against women, and even after all of the projects that have developed all over the world since, I would say, the 70s, the incidence of violence against women has not changed. It has not changed at all. So it tells us that imprisoning people does nothing to protect women, does nothing to protect children. So it allows us to move to a point where we see the urgency of a conversation about abolition.
Yeah, absolutely. And in many cases, the prison system is imprisoning these survivors of violence. I mean, one of the things that I always say that most surprised me in doing this book was the number of our narrators who had experienced childhood sexual abuse. And I say this as having done this work for 15 years and gotten in front of groups of people all the time and cited the statistics, saying more than 2/3 of people in women's prisons have experienced sexual or domestic violence prior to getting into prison. And and I've said that all the time. But reading the narratives, and for me, it said to me that the number we're far undercounting the number of these women who are imprisoned, who've experienced childhood sexual abuse and other forms of physical violence, but also just seeing the descriptions of the many myriad different and horrible ways that would happen, but also the numbing sameness of this is what they've experienced. And then because we provide no treatment for that and no therapy, they end up self-medicating in order to deal with this abuse, because it's a lot cheaper under our current health system to get heroin in the street often than to get decent talk therapy and help to deal with experience of childhood sexual abuse. And so then you have that, and that's our population that's in our prisons, is largely people who've experienced sexual and domestic violence. And then we're tossing them in prison, where they then, as Angela mentioned, get to relive the experience of being sexually assaulted. The strip searches themselves are very traumatic for people who've experienced sexual abuse and very invasive in many ways. And then you have many of the women who said getting a pap smear inside prison is just, it felt like being raped again. And you hear that over and over again. And so, it kind of continues that, and it makes you really just, as Angela said, you start to question the entire system, right? Because now we're punishing people for being addicted to drugs. We're punishing people for making bad choices because they've been addicted to drugs. And then we've broken them, and now we're going to throw them away. And that's kind of largely, I don't want to be too hyperbolic, but that's largely the way the system is functioning, especially in the women's prisons.
And the work that you've done over the years, I know I've been following your work since you were with Human Rights Watch, has really allowed us to understand these connections. And not very long ago, I think it was maybe about 4 months ago, I was speaking at the Richmond detention facility for women. Those of you who know the Bay Area, Richmond is adjacent to Oakland and Berkeley. And I went in and spent a day with the women inside of the detention facility. And I'll never forget, there was one woman who was so eloquent in her analysis of this relationship that we're talking about. She said that she had suffered. She said, I suffered so much pain, so much hurt, and nobody ever taught me how to deal with it. And because I didn't know how to deal with the pain that I was suffering, I inflicted pain on other people. And that is what led me to this institution. And she said, if someone had just told me that I could address that pain differently, then I wouldn't be here. And I think you said that people who are abused are criminalized for being abused and end up spending important years of their lives behind bars. This tells us something about the nature of the system and why it doesn't work and why it has really so little to do with creating a world that is safe. As a matter of fact, it does exactly the opposite.
Yeah, it really does. I mean, I want to, sort of thinking about in California, and another thing I know we wanted to touch upon was gender responsive movement. And we touched upon it a little bit in talking about the forced feminization and the way that the prison system feels the need for a binary male-female system. But California has this gender responsiveness movement, which is, purportedly to create a more gender responsive prison, a prison that's better for women. And so in light of what we've been talking about here, what do you think about that?
Well, the gender responsive movement had its origins under Governor Reagan, right? And it was an attempt to address the fact that the California prison system is so totally overcrowded. Well, a lot of you are probably aware of what has happened over the last period. The federal injunction to release 30 to 40,000 prisoners. Well, one of the early projects was to close down one of the women's prisons in Chowchilla. What's so interesting is that the two largest women's prisons in the entire world are located in this small town in Central California, right across the street from. So, what is that all about? And so the idea was to close down one of those, or not to close it down, but to remove all of the women from one of those prisons in order to get the overflow of men. And then these women would be sent to gender responsive prisons, smaller community-based prisons that would be putatively closer to their families and so forth. And what was so interesting was that the organization that Robin works with, Justice Now, helped to develop a movement which led to thousands of signatures by women prisoners who were opposed to this gender responsive program because it was clearly about the expansion of prisons. And there was one point where they were talking about private spaces, small settings, small correctional settings. So the private corporations were going to get in on it, and they would be profiting from this gender responsiveness. So it means that we really have to be vigilant. We really have to be wary, because something like gender responsive sounds great, doesn't it? Doesn't it? You would assume it was good. But as it turns out, it was all about the prison expansion, which California has already expanded beyond the imagination of anyone. I can remember being here in Los Angeles in 1968 and 69, and we were saying something like, there are 200,000 people in prison in the entire country, right? And now there are almost that many in prison in California. So, yeah.
Yeah, the gender.
Maybe you can talk a little bit about the larger, the larger question of releasing people from California's prisons and what's happening now in
With
this
the
realignment.
Yeah, all that.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, one of the things, even just to go back to that, because one of the things that we find interesting with this gender responsiveness movement, which now leads into realignment, is it's always the same number of people. They always say we have 4,500 women that we can put, that are no threat to public safety, so we can put them into these facilities. And it's been the same number since, I think, like 2004, which is interesting just in of itself for me. And of course, the second question is, if there's no threat to public safety, why are we spending more money building
Why
facilities?
are they in prison in the first place?
Which is, the obvious question that, we kept asking, like, excuse me. I'm so confused. What the first thing that they had said was, with the gender responsiveness, they're going to build these new facilities. But a lot of the places where they're going to build facilities were in the Central Valley. And, I don't have exact numbers, but I would say a good, let's say 80% of the people in women's prisons are from LA. And so they weren't talking about building the facilities actually close to people's families. They were talking about building facilities where the correctional union wanted them to build facilities. And that sort of has passed into now current day with realignment. They're because they're under court order now, they're talking about releasing people from prison and sending them to the counties. But what they're really talking about is sending them into in most cases, into the county jail system, which is actually, worse than the prison system and harder to have any oversight on. I mean, it's easier to provide oversight to the prison system, as ineffectual as oversight has been, but it's easier to do that than to the jail system. And that's kind of been the next step. And then they're talking about, and they continue, as Angela said, they always are talking about locked facilities and electronic bans on, again, people who have been acknowledged as being no threat to public safety. And that's, I think, one of the things that kind of we keep wrestling with in the realignment program is it could end up, and I say this to everyone in the room as sort of a small call to action, it could end up, we could have something good come out of this if we really pressure to have people not put into jails, to have them actually really released into the facilities and provide put money into facilities released into their communities, and put money into facilities that are actually community-based and not connected to the correctional system at all. And one other thing I do want to talk about the gender responsiveness program too, that we were also talking about a little bit earlier that I won't put out, is one of the things that I think is most concerning, worrisome about the Gender Responsiveness Committee is in 2006, at one of their meetings, they talked about looking into the cost effectiveness of providing tubal ligations to women right after giving birth. And then they said, because you can't do any elective surgery in prison, they said they would change that to being something that is medically necessary, which is a term that really has obviously a very eugenic ring to it, I think, for everyone in this room. And so that was that's sort of their vision of gender responsiveness. Again, they're putting women into the box of where women are supposed to be, and some women really aren't deserving of being moms, right? And those are the women who have been in prison, and those are largely Black and brown women, but also all women in prison. And so that was saying the Gender Responsiveness Committee, that was their proposal that they put out. And I found that deeply troubling. And then I found it deeply troubling that they then continued to pursue it and actually do it without any public comment. And, so that's sort of, just getting into the gender responsiveness movement. And those are the people who led that, those are the people in charge of realignment. So that's my little call to action, that we need to make sure that realignment actually ends up with people getting out and not staying in.
And also what's happened in the huge maximum security women's institutions in California is that programs have been dismantled that used to be available to women who were there. And I was, a number of months ago, I spent a day inside of Central California Women's Facility. And so many of the women said, we used to have educational programs. Now there's nothing. There's nothing for us to do. And so I saw these women, along with all of the other men and trans prisoners in these institutions in California, treated as garbage. They're treated as garbage. They're treated as superfluous to whatever kind of society is supposed to exist out here in the so-called free world. And recently, in relation to the Occupy movement, I like the way Claudia talked about the other 1%, the 1% at the very bottom. And so it seems to me that as we generate excitement about the new activism that's happening now. As a matter of fact, I'll just tell you a story. I spoke last night in Oakland with John Carlos. You remember John Carlos, who I think he had on the left glove with Tommy Smith in 1968 in Mexico City. And there was this young black woman who came up to me, and she asked me about hair. I usually, don't like to talk about hair politics because somehow I don't know why it is that people think that I'm the only one who, had a natural back in those days. Everybody who was involved, and people my age will remember that. And somehow it gets attached to me. But anyway, she was saying. She was asking me to talk about the political significance of the Afro. And she asked me whether there was one. I said, of course there was. We used to get picked up on the streets of L.A. Just because we, wore our hair natural. And it was, a way of indicating a kind of radical, revolutionary approach. And she says, and that's happening again. And she got so excited. She said, and look at all of the black women who are wearing their hair natural. The movement is returning. We can tell it from the hair. So I stopped and I said, I really hope you're right. But I do think that it's important to bring some of these issues into the new activism. And if we talk about the 99% rising up against the 1%, we also have to think about who's at the bottom tiers of the hierarchy. We can't simply assume that any one grouping within the 99% can provide us the most enlightened leadership about what to do and where to go. And if we think about those who are the worst off, those who are the bottom 1%, that would certainly be those who are behind bars, that 1 in 100 adults behind bars. And I think now it's possible to talk about people in prison without producing the really negative reactions that used to get produced whenever you talked about people in prison. Because the assumption was if people are in prison, it's because they belong there. It's because they did something wrong, right? But we know that there are so many people who've done a lot of things wrong, who never made it into prison, right? And we also know that, like I was talking about the example of the young woman, that so many people are in prison because they've been hurt themselves. And so many people are in prison because they don't have the opportunity to get an education. So many people are there because there is no healthcare system, physical healthcare system, mental healthcare system that will assist people to address problems that have been created by a society that is organized in such a way as to benefit the 1% as opposed to the 99%.
Yeah. And one of the things that you feel is the prison system is also reinforcing that system of no self-worth, right? That the whole system is constantly, it's based upon removing your self-worth. It's telling you you're nothing all the time. You have no privacy rights. You have no right to be seen as a human. You're a number. Once you get in, you're a number, and you respond to your number. And it's it's just, it becomes fully internalized. And it's actually interesting, one of our narrators was in that space, and she had experienced childhood sexual abuse, and then had been in a violent relationship, and in a fight, one of her brothers had killed her batterer, and she was in prison as an accomplice, essentially for wishing him dead. And we would not, most of the people who came to our narrators actually had come to a space of having self-worth, and she wasn't in that space yet, but one of her friends inside wrote us and begged us to talk to her. Mm-hmm. And I remember the interviewer went in and talked to her, and she said, she's really nice, but nothing really bad has happened to her. And I said, all right, well, then, just send me the transcript. And I read the transcript, and I'm like, gosh, nothing that bad has happened to her, blah, blah, blah. And then, you start reading it a little bit closer, and you realize she's just listed like 3 calamitous events that's happened to her inside. Like 3, she had a hysterectomy, which may or may not have been needed, but they never gave her any pain medication for that. Then you realize you've read this weird story about this biopsy, and then you realize that she's just told you about, who knows if she had a stroke or not, but it's described this whole experience of waking up and half of her body was numb, and she couldn't speak, and then she went to work anyway because she couldn't even think about not going to work, and she finally saw an outside neurologist who found white spots in her brain, and then they said, well, the prison neurologist is going to take care of this, and that was the end of that, and that was 3 years ago. And they said she had white spot disease, which I don't think is a Mayo Clinic acknowledged disease. Yeah. But what I realized was her voice was she had so little sense of any self-worth, of any value, that she had minimized this. None of this seemed important to her, and the way that she talked about it made it almost sound not important to us until you started reading it, and you read it the second time, you're like, are you kidding me? This is awful. This is just, you've just told me a litany of just awfulness. And I just say that's sort of, the prison system reinforces it, which is, and I'm transitioning us into human rights. And that's one thing, that human rights, that we use human rights inside, because that kind of puts that sense of no self-worth, for us, it put it on its end, it challenged it. And saying that actually, soap is important because you need soap to keep yourself healthy, and there's a right to health under international law. Actually, the United Nations thinks that what's happening to you is really bad. And even though the Guard says that nobody cares, here's some, official document from the United Nations actually saying exactly what's happening to you is wrong. And we've had that sort of, it starts giving the sense that there is self-worth. And they kind of, one of the people we work with inside said it was like the whole world was in Technicolor now. And they couldn't get her out of the library because she realized she had rights. But that's, part of the system is it takes these folks who've been beaten down, and then they beat them down further and tell them, you have no right, you have nothing, you're not worth anything. And so they're not going to challenge it because they don't think they can, they don't think they should, they think this is the way it should be. And of course, a lot of us think it's the way it should be. So I guess that's sort of a very poor transition to ask you what you think about using human rights in this work.
Well, I think it's really important to use human rights strategies, even though most wardens in this country have no idea that the United Nations has passed all kinds of conventions, and there are all kinds of instruments that are directed against totalitarian prison practices. Going all the way back to the 50s and the standard minimum rules. But why I think human rights are really important, because it requires us to stand back and look at a much larger picture. We can see, what is happening to individuals who are incarcerated and how damaging this system is. But we don't often recognize the extent to which this has become a model that is global in scale, and that the U.S., which represents itself as the paragon of democracy. I just saw this great bumper sticker the other day that says something about be careful or America will inflict democracy on you. And in many ways, the prison as an institution is an integral element of the kind of democracy that the U.S. represents. If we look at the history of imprisonment as the dominant mode of punishment, it begins with the American Revolution. And the penitentiary is the new democratic mode of punishment. And then we ask, well, how did countries in what we now call the southern region, India, Africa, how did they end up using prisons? Through the colonial process. Although it should be pointed out that in a place like India, which will soon outstrip China in terms of its population, there are about 200,000 people in prison in the entire country of India. And if you look at a country like South Africa, which represented our hope, our dreams for non-racist, non-sexist society, and now you have US-based private prison corporations, running supermaxes in South Africa. So I mention this because I think that it is important to recognize the abolitionist movement to which we referred, the prison abolitionist movement, as a movement that has global dimensions. It's not just about dealing with the 2.4 million people who are behind bars here, or the 1 in 37 people who are under the control of the criminal justice system. It's about trying to present new models of democracy for the world. And if we don't do something about this out of control prison system in the US, it will destroy the entire world, not only us who inhabit this country, but in Colombia, where they're building prisons because they have pushed people off land that was used to grow food that people survived on, and now what they're doing is they're growing sugarcane to create biofuel for those of us who want to be conscious of the environment in the north. And they push people off the land who have nowhere to go, and they're in slums, and now they're building in outside of they're building one of what will be the largest prison in South America to hold people who have become superfluous, who can no longer take care of themselves because they have been deterritorialized. Their land has been taken from them by huge agricultural corporations. So it's a part of the whole globalization process. It's a part of the whole neoliberal juggernaut.
Prisons is an export business for the United States. And the gender responsiveness movement is an export business of the United States. So they're trying to convince the United Nations to take on a standard minimum rule for female prisons, which in many ways, many countries don't have like an established women's prison system the way we do here. It's going to lead to that creation of that. And again, the gendering of it, the intense gendering of the entire program, and which is deeply troubling. I'm wondering if this is a good time to go to questions, or you want to keep chatting?
How long have we been talking?
It's not long enough. Is that what someone said?
45 minutes?
50?
50 minutes. Oh, yeah. Well, we said we would converse between 40 and 60 minutes. So 50 minutes seems the perfect
Sounds right.
time
Yeah, and we
to
kinda-
open it up
Yeah, it
and
felt
to
like we're-
allow you to
Yeah,
join in
yeah.
the conversation.
And I thought we'd, because also ending on that note from Angela, call to look at the internationalization of that is also, I think, a good place to start off our questions.
So ladies and gentlemen, we have ushers in the aisles with microphones, and we'd appreciate it if you could wait till you have a microphone in your hands. Where's the first question? There's a question right down here.
How does it feel to be a peanut facing a juggernaut? Is there any alternative to that positioning that's taken place over and over again? This horrible situation that you lay out beautifully. And what's done? How does the peanut face the juggernaut? Is there an alternative?
Well, I don't know how many of you are still excited about the Occupy movement. But I think that demonstrates that we can do something. I was, I had the opportunity to speak at a number of Occupy sites recently. I was speaking at a conference on Herbert Marcuse at University of Pennsylvania not too long ago. And, mostly philosophers were there, but also philosophers who were interested in activism, as Herbert Marcuse was. And after the keynote plenary, there were about, 1,500 people there. There was the spontaneous decision for the entire audience to march down to the Occupy site. And so we left this huge hall, it was about 9:30 in the evening, and marched down the streets. We thought maybe the cops would try to stop us, but as it turned out, some of the students who work with the Occupy movement there had been doing organizing with the taxi drivers. And so this fleet of taxis came and escorted us to the site. It was absolutely amazing. It was really, really incredible. And then one other thing, when I returned to Oakland, after having gone to the Occupy site at Wall Street and also their General Assemblies at Washington Square Park in New York, so I experienced that. It was great. And then I got back to Oakland just in time for the general strike on November 2nd. And they told you that there were just a few thousand people. But the real estimates are, say, between 10 and 15,000. It was absolutely amazing. There were so many people. There were people of all ages, of all racial and ethnic backgrounds. There were children. There were kids and strollers. And everybody was just so happy as we marched to the port to shut down the port. And I saw quite a few people of my generation. And they said, "It's happening! It's happening! Finally, it's happening!" So, I think that there is. It's not hopeless. I just spoke at Occupy Berlin last week, and it was just amazing to see this new sense of internationalism that is developing, and people are aware of the ways in which we have to come together globally if we're going to accomplish anything. And this is certainly true for the prison abolitionist movement, the 21st century abolitionist movement. It has to be a global movement.
Yeah, and I just want to add on to that. And it's definitely, I mean, I think when you think about it, building a world without prison seems very overwhelming, and there's all these different aspects to it. But it's not, I mean, first of all, it's not like one peanut, right? We're all like together in it and thinking about that. And there's a lot of manageable ways to kind of get started. Like we talked about the realignment movement, sort of keeping on top of that and making sure that people aren't being sent into county jails, but are actually being sent to their communities. Keeping on top of mandatory minimums and drug laws. Voting in favor of that, voting in favor of ending 3 strikes legislation. And then on the other side, yes, please, thank you, yeah. Voting in favor of putting more money into our schools and making our schools not a pipeline to prisons, not a guarded military place, but to be schools a place where people build a love of learning. Putting real changes into our healthcare system so that people can get the drug rehabilitation they need, the therapy that they need, and the healthcare that they need to be productive members, right? To not be and then not be tossed in jail because you're addicted to drugs and you're poor, because if you're addicted to drugs and you're not poor, you're not tossed in jail. And so, all of those pieces, and to just kind of just every time you vision the paper, every time you vote, every time you think about your activism, just thinking in terms of that area. How do I pull money out of the prison system where it's not doing any good, really, and is doing much worse in many, many, many ways, and put it into communities where it really needs to be used and utilized and to flower and to change. And so it's really step by step, but we can make a difference if we don't get overwhelmed by what's ahead of us.
And what do we do to really begin to address the problems that the prison presumes to address? Right. So instead of simply sending people to prison who commit horrible acts of violence against women, for example, how do we solve the problems? How do we get rid of violence against women? And how do we get rid of, child sexual abuse? There is so much child sexual abuse that continues to reproduce itself, and the prison plays a role in the reproduction of child sexual abuse, because when you assume that the best way to deal with a problem that is so horrendous as that is to just get rid of the people, just send them to prison, then you can forget. And then in the meantime, it is the person who was abused, the child who was abused, who has no way of dealing with all of that pain and suffering, oftentimes grows up to become an abuser himself or herself even. So how do we stop those cycles? Prisons add to it. And that's, I think, a really powerful argument for the abolition of prison. And we should, constantly point out, it's not that we minimize the problems that the prison tries to deal with. On the contrary, we really want to solve them. We don't want to simply sweep them under the rug where they grow and grow and grow.
That's exactly right.
Question in the back here in the turquoise.
Hi, how are you? My name is Whitney. I'm a graduate student at UCLA, and I actually...
Where are you?
At UCLA.
Oh, there are you.
I'm right here. Hi. I'm actually part of the Occupy UCLA movement, and we've actually renamed our plaza Angela Davis Plaza. So it's an honor to hear you. And my question is I think that, over the past couple of weeks, through the Occupy movement, we've seen incredible images of the police state, right, and how the police state functions. And I'm just curious if you could address sort of the connections of the police state on the outside and how it functions, and its relationship to sort of the police state on the inside with these people that you're talking about in your book, and women in prison.
Yeah, it's a really important question. And I guess everyone has seen the image of the orange pepper spray that UC Davis police, and it's so amazing that they thought they could just do that. right?
Sure.
Because the assumption is that law enforcement and, both those outside and inside, that they're able to inflict, whatever violence they want on people, and nothing will happen. They're totally immune to any kind of responses. So I think that this is the time to begin to make those connections. I want to also point out that the death penalty is an important element, an important ingredient of these processes that we're talking about, and we should not forget Troy Davis. And I don't think it was accidental that the movement to save the life of Troy Davis emerged precisely at the same time as the Occupy movement. And not only in this country, but all over the world. There was an amazing free Troy Davis movement in Germany. And I was just invited by some of the people who organized that to speak in Berlin last week. So I think you're absolutely right. We have to make those connections and point out that if police are able to do what they did in Oakland, in the way that, and now, of course, the police have dismantled so many of the Occupy sites across the country. We have to, stand up and speak out, not only against the police, but against the city administrations and the state governments, and against the federal government, and we also have to say something to Obama about this. It's really interesting that, and I don't want to go on and on, Robin, but I think it's really important for us to recognize that the election 3 years ago was a really important moment in the history of this country. And many of us are so disappointed in Obama that we forget the world historical significance of that election. And the fact that so many people did not believe it was possible to elect a black man as president. As a matter of fact, the majority of black people were for Hillary. You remember that? And then there were these young people who believed that it was really possible to achieve this dream. And they worked on it, and they organized, and they used all of the new technological modes of communication, their texting and their social networking and all of that. And then he was elected. And you remember that day? Let's not forget that. We, as people who live in this country, we are encouraged to be amnesiacs when it comes to history. We're encouraged to forget. Let's not forget that moment. That was a triumphant moment. And I don't think that we should discount the fact that the Occupy movement emerged at this time. And I say that this is the movement that really should have emerged the day after the election. And we should have been able to put the kind of pressure on Obama that would have prevented the war in Afghanistan, and that would have brought us a better health care system, and would have accomplished so many of the things we are disappointed about not having accomplished today. So, I just wanted to, put that in, because we cannot allow one of these Republicans to be elected.
I just a little bit back to the original story. We were I think that one thing that Occupy has shown us is how the police behave with this sense of impunity, right? And that sort of highlighted that for us. And the same thing that happens inside. And the reason why many of you in this audience may not have known about the things that happen inside women's prisons or men's prisons for that matter is because the prisons have they operate with impunity within their little fiefdom of the prisons, and they put a lot of energy into making sure that we don't find out about it. So in California, there's a media ban. Journalists aren't allowed to go into the prisons, or if they do go in, they can only speak to people that have been selected by the prison. In terms, and I'm saying this also in light of doing this book, it was incredibly difficult. It's very difficult to get in the prison and visit if you're not an attorney. Phone calls are ludicrously expensive. People in prison can only collect phone calls, obviously, but they can't just make a collect phone call using any collect phone call system. Every state has a monopoly contract with a telephone carrier, so the collect phone calls are done at a incredibly elevated rate. So that's very expensive, and you actually have to have a contract. You can't just call; you have to have a contract with that telephone carrier before you can receive phone calls from prison, which is obviously very difficult for reporting abuses, but is even more obviously a burden on the families. And so these are families that in many cases are already low income. They can't afford an enormous phone bill of the sort that you would get to have regular conversations with friends inside. Letters are regularly confiscated. And so all of these pieces are put in place in order for us not to hear about it. And there's I just have to put this out there, there's an incredibly damaging law that was passed in the federal law 1994 called the Prison Litigation Reform Act. And that basically makes it incredibly difficult to file lawsuits against prisons and against abuses that they do inside the prisons. And so there's been a lot of things put in place to make sure that we don't hear about it, and so that they can maintain their police state with little or no oversight.
And I think it's important to remember the connection between those overt acts of the police state and what we may not necessarily consider to be instances of police violence. I was just thinking about, we were talking about Valley State and CCWF, and I was remembering when Ted Koppel went into the prison and spent a week there, and he discovered that so many of the women were saying to him, every time I get sick, whether I have a headache or a cold, I get a gynecological exam.
You get pap smear.
A pap smear, a
For
gynecologic for a cold. And so Ted Koppel, right, who...
kept a straight face.
yeah, and...
Well, actually, I'm going to say kept the straight when you talk to the doctor. That's what I meant with the kept the straight face.
What happened was that he then went to the doctor who was in charge of the whole prison and asked him, is it true that, what all of these women have been telling me, that when they have headaches and when they have colds, they get gynecological exams? And he said, well, these women have not had male contact for a long time. And, some of them like it.
Yeah. Well, that's it. And then Ted
He
Koppel.
said this.
He did. I mean, it's like, actually, we were just talking about this in the green room, and I said, that's still my favorite tape ever. And we're like, yeah, we all remember it. And then, Ted Koppel asked the follow-up question, because he could not believe, this guy just said this on camera, are you saying that they want the pap smears?
Yeah.
And then the guy said, yeah. But the thing that I found amazing, and he was fired or reassigned, is in my years of working, so that was about 15 years ago, I've seen 2 more pap smear doctors.
Yeah.
And that's what we call them, the pap smear doctors. The doctors who give you pap smears all the time because they want to. But, you're not coming in the office for anything that's pap smear. So I think that's something that really crystallizes for me what the prison system does to the people inside and the people who work there. Because there have been 3 pap smear doctors you have to believe there's something about being in a prison and working here and having this absolute control that makes you feel that you can give a woman a gynecological exam for no reason at all the time.
And this is linked to the violence of the cop who sprays protesters, with pepper spray. I think it's really important for us to understand those connections.
Sorry.
Angela, backstage you mentioned all the other types of prisons that people don't actually know exist in the United States. Do you want to mention those?
Well, there's a whole circuit of carceral institutions. So we not only have the state prisons, the federal prisons, the county jails, but we have jails in Indian country. It's another category of institutions that incarcerate people. There are, of course, military prisons. There are also detention facilities for immigrants. And the point that you made, Claudia, early on about the fact that CCA, Corrections Corporation of America, which is the largest private prison corporation in the world, helped to draft the Arizona anti-immigrant legislation because obviously it would lead them to profitable ventures of building more institutions to incarcerate immigrants.
Thanks. I wanted to, in answer to Ed's question about the peanut, I guess we need to educate. Maybe we need like a big documentary to beyond this population. But there are organizations. I volunteered at a nonprofit legal center, and we go into the women's jail in Linwood. The contract ran out. There's no funding, but I see Patsy here. The goal is to educate the women prisoners about their legal rights, and so that they learn how to deal with issues of domestic violence, how to get their children back out of the foster care system, so that when they are, it's called the Harriet Buhey Center for Family Law. But we need more programs like this. We need funding, and
Did you have a question? A specific
the question is how can we, take the money out of the prison business and put it into the education business, because this is really what works to keep people from coming back in.
And let's make sure that education doesn't become a business. Because that's one of the problems now, that education is so corporatized. She had a question. She's had her hand up for a while. Okay, sorry.
Thank you. Hello, ladies. My question actually kind of piggybacks off of the last in terms of education. We all understand that in order to get our priorities straight, we have to funnel money into education out of the prison system. In terms of the money that stays within the prison system, you mentioned earlier, Robin, about how there are no more of those educational programs for these female prisoners. Sorry. And I'm wondering, were those were those laws that were overturned? What happened to take those educational
Budget
opportunities away from the prisoners, and how can we perhaps get them back? Is it something that we go through the legislature, or is it something that we'd have to deal with these privatized companies? How do we get education back into these prison systems to give these people a chance?
Those were budget cuts. So almost there's no, we have no real legislative authority to make sure that they're going in. And, it was done within the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, that decision. There were administrative hearings, but the legislature, has chosen, I suppose, to some extent, to have little control over that. But there's little that we can do. And then I should also say, as a cautionary tale, those organizations that do get to go inside and provide some education are under my vocabulary is totally gone now, but they're under the watch of the CDCR. Their ability to go in can be taken away at any point of time. So there was once a fabulous group of doulas that went into the prison system to provide, pregnancy information and support to pregnant women inside, and then be there for their birth, and then their access to the prison was just cut off for no reason. I mean, they don't know what the reason was. And so that's the other thing, and that's kind of why it's very frustrating to deal with that. I mean, I don't want to say don't call your legislator and ask for that. I think it's worth it, and I think it's worth pointing out because, they have very little to engage themselves right now. I mean, you're lucky. There's very few classes. All the art classes are gone. All the educational programs are gone. You have to pay a huge amount of money if you want to try to get any college classes. There's very little that they can do. So I don't want to say don't do it, but I'm also saying I would put energy into trying to get people out, because everything that has to go for the prison system, it's so fraught with that and with the constant fear that they're going to be tossed out. But as I said, it was budget cuts, and it's budget cuts all around, right? Because these nonprofits that are providing good programs, they don't have that much money right now either. I mean, the economy, the recession is hitting all of these parties. So it's volunteering that and trying to get in, but especially in California, that's very much of an uphill road. It's not like trying to get in Oregon prisons, which is a totally different situation.
And then, there's the larger process. It's been going on since the 90s. It's been going on since the Clinton administration and the Omnibus Crime Act that made it impossible for prisoners to receive Pell Grant funding. And so many of the educational programs all over the country were funded through Pell Grants. You were talking about documentaries. There's a really great documentary. It was done, I think maybe around the end of the 90s. As you get older, time compresses, so I don't know. It could have been later, earlier. But it was called The Last Graduation, and it's about the dismantling of an educational institution that was run in Greenhaven Prison in New York by Marist College. They ran a BA program. It was amazing. They were graduating substantial numbers of prisoners every year, and this was the last graduation. It shows them dismantling the whole program because the funds were cut. There used to be huge numbers of prisoner produced newspapers and magazines, and virtually all of those disappeared as a result of the Pell Grant, the action the legal action that made Pell Grants inaccessible to prisoners.
Hi, my name is Carmina. I was just wondering if you could just share any thoughts about, last year President Obama signing the Fair Sentencing Act into law, and just kind of recently being in the news for commuting, the crack. So just how long it took for that to happen, if that's a sign of very, positive change in some direction that the president would do that. Just any thoughts.
I think you said it. First of all, there never should have been this discrepancy. And when you look at the number of people who are in prison as a result of this discrepancy, as a result of the so-called war on drugs, we see the extent to which that has fueled the soaring rates of people in prison, especially women in prison, right? Because a vastly disproportionate number of women are in prison on charges that are drug charges or related to drug charges. Yeah. And when you look at the federal system, and you see all of the women who are in prison because they've been in a relationship with a man who was supposedly involved with drugs, and they end up getting longer sentences than The man.
Right, 'cause they have nothing to trade for a plea bargain. They've
Right,
got
they
no
can't
information.
say, oh, okay, I'll give you the higher ups, which if the man who's really involved in the trafficking can do that. But the woman who's just in a relationship with the man involved in the trafficking has nothing to offer. And so she gets 25 years, 30 years in prison. You see so many women in federal prisons especially.
Yeah. I mean, it's shocking. It's more than 2/3, I think, is the number on drug or drug-related. Or, a lot of times because they're an accomplice, or, a lot of people in for murder are part of that piece. They're in the car, they took a phone call, or whatever. So I guess I would sort of say, boy, it sure took a long time to pass that law, considering I was in law school and we were already talking about it. Like, this should have been done a while ago. And it was a step forward, but it was a small step.
Hi, first of all, I want to say I'm so excited because I was here between 68 and 72, and you were our hero. So let me calm myself down and say, I want to know I would like you to speak to more practical solutions. I use my UCLA education to get into education, and I realized that education alone didn't help our movement. What helped our movement, what turned the tide, was an awareness. And so can you speak to what's being done? Because this is a violent society, this is a drug-infested society. And until, like Harriet Tubman said, and she could have freed more slaves if they knew they were slaves, what's being done in order to instill that awareness?
Well, I think the point that you're making is that it's not sufficient simply to ask for more of the same educational system that we already have.
Yeah.
That we have to, if we're serious about prison abolition, we have to also talk about the transformation of the educational system. And one of the problems is that education, as I was saying before, has become so thoroughly corporatized, so thoroughly privatized, like everything else, like healthcare and like imprisonment. So I always think about my mother, who used to tell us this story when we were growing up about how she, basically ran away from home to go to school. And growing up, you heard it so much, you didn't think of it as being, so dramatic. But when my mother passed a few years ago, we were talking about her life. My siblings and I said, wow, we never realized, what she did, how powerful the drive for education must have been with her. She was a foster child living in the country in Alabama, where there were no schools, no high schools for black people. And when she was about 13, when her foster parents assumed that she would get a job after graduating from elementary school, she basically ran away from home. And she moved to Birmingham, Alabama, the big city. And she got a room at the YWCA. And she went to high school. And when I think about the way in which our lives have been totally, driven by what we consider to be completely what we take for granted, that we always took for granted we would go to school. We always took for granted we would go to college. But thinking about, what must have driven a 13-year-old child back in the late 20s, early 30s, to want to get an education. And so it meant something to her. It wasn't just about learning how to read, learning how to write, whatever. It was about freedom. It was about a different life, a different It was about being able to imagine something entirely different from what she experienced. And I think that this is the kind of education we need, an education that will allow young people to imagine many possible futures and not feel so ensconced in what exists in the present. And so we have to think about education as not just being in institutions, but education as happening so many different, in many other venues. Art as education, aesthetic education. I was talking before, and I was saying, after going through the exhibit, it occurred to me that I recognized, so many of the artists, and I recognized them because they were involved in the movement. And as a matter of fact, I was looking at Dale and Alonzo Davis. I went to kindergarten with them in Birmingham, Alabama, and Samela Lewis and Betty. I was saying, oh my God, these are the people who made the movement possible. And why is it when we tell the story of the movement, we don't talk about the artists, and we don't talk about the way art educated us about the possibilities of very different futures from the present we were experiencing at that time. And so I think we need this more capacious understanding about what it means to be educated, to be truly educated. And then I think that would mean that we would no longer experience the need for such an institution as the prison that accomplishes the very opposite. It prevents our imagination from soaring.
I can't imagine a better note to go out on. So please join me in thanking Robin Levy and Angela Davis.